does things. Unlike me, James Nixey does work, you know. So this is Dan Whitman. Really honored to have James Nixey on February 3rd in both countries, I think, 2025. And 2025 has been a challenging few weeks. I mean, the only story of today that I can even bring to people's attention, the hostile attempt to either abolish or take over U.S. Agency for International Development. This is a very interesting story. I know young people who were recently hired and then let go, and they're very gloomy and depressed. If aid survives under another agency like the Department of State, I would say that I don't see a problem with that. Condoleezza Rice meant to do that in 2004. She created a bureau called FF for Foreign Assistance. It never worked, but the idea was it's all part of one foreign policy effort. Anyway, I just mentioned that because that's in today's news. James Nixey, Chatham House. I looked up Chatham House. I think Chatham House and Council on Foreign Relations are exactly the same age, 1990.
Exactly, yeah, precisely. They were created at the same time for the same reason, by the same people.
Yes, post World War I to see if we could avoid another one. We can't hold you responsible because you weren't there in 1990. But James, your work is fascinating. When we met 2 years ago.
Yeah.
At that time, you had just
published 1.5. Yeah.
Oh, well, good. You see, you keep very good track. You were at the Ukraine Culture Center in Washington, and you were presenting a pamphlet pointing out the fallacies. The fallacy. There we go. Now, you don't have to begin with that, but we do want to touch on that at some point.
Yeah, of course.
And tell us first, we kind of understand Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Tell us about Chatham House, which is so famous.
Yeah, of course.
And rightly so. Tell us.
Okay, so, well, good morning, everybody. I know it's morning over there with you guys, just mid-afternoon here, and I am really delighted to be talking to you all. It looks like a fantastic group from what Dan has been telling me beforehand and just now.
It is.
And it's my honor. It really is. So I'm just so happy and excited to be talking to you, and I'll do what I can to, elucidate a little bit about Chatham House and about the region that I'm tasked with, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions, even if I do have to go in sort of 51 minutes time. But Chatham House, I mean, there's not too much mystery. I mean, I think it has an air of mystique around it because of the name and the Chatham House rule, which you've probably heard of. But just to go into it, the Chatham House rule is a rule of non-attribution, whereby anything that is said in a meeting can be used and reported, but not the person who said it. So therefore, it's designed to protect the speaker or speakers.
Yep.
And that is used universally beyond international relations, and is probably more famous than our research and anything else. But it's you're right, 103, 104 years old, and that means that I think yes, there is a certain cachet to that. It's also there's a certain cachet to size as well, and by comparison of the US think tanks, it's a little bit smaller with Brookings, with CFR itself. Carnegie, the CSIS, I've missed one out. I've forgotten the major one off the top of my head.
Heritage.
Heritage. Yeah, well, yes, Heritage is a bit smaller, but yeah. And so Chatham House is quite large by European standards anyway, with 170 people in it and another 150 associates on top of that. But the mission is basic. Without wishing to sound too cheesy, the mission is to secure a sustainable, prosperous and just world. And I know that does sound a little against the grain right now, but it does get me out of bed most mornings. If we can, I was always taught. I mean, Dan and I were talking about being pro-Ukrainian just before you guys came on board, and it always helps to be right. It does help to be right first of all, and even if it is against the grain, even if the world isn't going the way we want it, even if support for Ukraine looks like it might be stalling, and we must go into that, then it's not our job to go with the flow and to go with what the politicians are dictating, if you like. It's our job to try to tell them why mistakes are being made and what the repercussions of those mistakes are, and how you can have a better world. So that's one thing. So that's the house. That's a house in general. Just briefly, I don't want to go too much into it, but of course, any questions, love to answer,
I could, I
even about
could, I
careers and
could
stuff like
send
that.
one already. You talk about
Yeah,
informing and possibly influencing politicians in the U.S.
yeah.
It's well known that Heritage basically created the matrix that's now being played out. But generally, think tanks, politicians don't in America don't really think respond to think tanks.
Well,
I mean, is it comparable? And
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to over egg our influence and our ability, our power. Of course, there's a certain impetuosity involved in not being a policymaker, but at the same time, they can't get all of their ideas from within government. And whilst you never can measure it, particularly unless you want to measure it in terms of clicks and reads and that kind of stuff, of course, which is fine, but it's limited. Then I think I think I would argue that we have an influence cumulatively over time.
Mhm.
So I don't want to tell you that that report that we mentioned, Dan, was hugely influential, and in fact, in a sense, I think the recommendations have not been taken up, thus proving your point. I would argue that I would argue that the in terms of our views of Russia overall, then governments have hardened over time, and that now that of course may well be due to Russia's own actions, not due to the think tank world. But many of us in many think tanks, I don't want to single Chatham House out here, but have been arguing that Russia poses a threat, its tentacles connected to the center, to global security and stability, and for quite a long time. And I mean pretty much since the beginning of the Putin era, when you think that Putin began by closing down TV stations in the very first year he came into power. So I insofar as anybody has any degree of influence, I think to a certain extent you've got to keep bashing away. And so if you take an example like, should Ukraine be in NATO? That's not the way in which the world is going. I know that the Americans in particular and the Germans don't want Ukraine in NATO. I personally do. I think if you can make that argument, you should make that argument. And maybe you can break them down over time. Of course, not next week and next month. Of course, and again, that will also be dictated by events because if Russia were to lose the war, then I think the argument for Ukraine being in NATO would be stronger as it happens. Anyway, we can go into that later on. Just on Chatham House again, super briefly. Um, so it's a membership organization. We raise our own funds. We don't get a sustainable, as in a we do get money from governments, including the US and the UK government, but not only them, but not obviously the dubious governments of the world, naturally. And so that, and along with the corporate sector and foundations, I'm going to the US next week to see some foundations anyway. So yeah, fundraising is an important part of our work, I'm afraid. And you have to do that to sustain a think tank of 170 people, as I say. But it's only a 20 million pound a year. That must be about 30 million pound a year, $30 million pound a year, $30 million a year turnover institute, if that's to put it into perspective there. So yeah, there's a lot of publishing, a lot of convening. Chatham House does seem to be quite a magnetic place at which to attract high-level speakers. I have been trying to get General Kellogg this week on his way to the Munich Security Forum. I'll see if that works. But it shouldn't just be for the high and mighty. It should be for academics and analysts articulating the results, or just putting out ideas connected to their research. Quite frankly, so I think the small scale is as important as the large scale and the highfalutin foreign
Yeah,
ministers' defense.
for those on the call who are not Ukrainian, explain General Kellogg.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So
Yeah.
he has been tasked with being the US, America's special envoy for Ukraine and to solve the Ukraine crisis. Obviously, this cannot be done in 24 hours, as was initially mentioned, nor in 24 days. I think they've been talking about 100 days of late. I suspect it won't even be that easy as it happens. But he is Trump's man
Mhm.
now in charge of resolving this problem. If you think it's a problem that can be resolved in the sense of that word, I'm not so sure I would agree. But anyway, the general point I was making is that yes, we will try to attract high level speakers, and we have had most of them over the years. the great and the not so great, if I'm honest with you. In fact, I'll show you another piece of paper here. It says this is a roundtable meeting from 1991, well before I joined Chatham House, with a guy called who with it was about it's about it's a Russia roundtable to discuss what's going on in Russia, and it was being the speaker was a guy called Anatoly Sobchak. He was a mayor of Leningrad.
Yeah.
And on the back page, it says that one of the participants was Vladimir Putin. Um,
Oh my gosh.
and
Oh
so
my
he was there
gosh.
just as a mid-level, low-level functionary back in 1991. And if only we knew what would become of him, maybe
Well,
we could have done
and
something about it.
the famous incident, what, 2 or 3 years after that, when the Queen received Putin. Um,
Exactly,
and
exactly. Yeah,
so
back in
was she,
2001, I think. Yeah.
yeah, somebody misled her, perhaps. I don't know if you have an opinion about that. We know we know absolutely from the day Vladimir Karamurza talks about the
Mm.
day that Putin unveiled a statue to, it was not Andropov, it was one of the others.
To Dzerzhinsky, wasn't it?
No,
Was it
no, it
Dzerzhinsky?
was one of the party premiers and one of the most vicious,
Uh,
uh, the most
I
cruel.
I thought it was Dzerzhinsky. I could be wrong. I
Could
could be
be.
wrong.
It could be. Karamurza said that it was a premiere, and he said that's all I needed to know. The minute he unveiled that statue,
Yeah.
the West was caught unaware and unprepared, and should have noticed these things.
Absolutely, and so early on, as you say. I mean, as I mentioned, the closing down of Russian television stations in the first year. He came into power saying he was suspicious of elections. The Kursk disaster. If you look at his callous reaction to the
Mhm.
loss of Russian lives on the Kursk submarine. I mean, again, these are all in the very first year. To say nothing of only a few years down the line, we're talking about the incarceration of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who you just mentioned, in 2003, and then the poisoning with polonium of Alexander Litvinenko on the streets of
Right.
London in
Yes.
2006. I mean, this is all these things are almost 20 years ago, and somehow people have only just woken up, and I say only just woken up because
Yeah.
I would mention if we go back to Donald Trump again for a second, then he suddenly seems to have woken up to the fact that Russia is maybe not as powerful as he might have previously anticipated
Maybe.
or said. So
Yeah.
maybe, but look, being slow and getting there in the end is perhaps better than not getting there at all.
Yeah.
I suppose, which is why I was
Wait.
saying to Dan before we came on this call that I'm a
Yeah.
relative optimist as it happens.
That
Anyway, let's
that
where do you want me to? So that's a bit about Chatham House, anyway. But obviously, just to be clear, I'm the director of the Russia and Eurasia program, ladies and gents, and that looks at all of the former Soviet states. It's a misnamed program because Russia and Eurasia. I mean, where is Ukraine in that? Where's Moldova in that?
yeah.
It's not a great title. I can't call it the formerly Soviet program, of course, because that would be
Uh,
even more anachronistic. It's an anachronistic region when you think about it with different countries going in different directions at different levels of development. Kyrgyzstan's is different to Moldova's, is different to Russia's, of course, is different to Georgia's, different to Ukraine's. So I obviously have a problem with the name of the program,
I'm
and
glad.
and and there you go.
Yeah, let me say,
Yeah,
Ukrainians I've spoken with, including Ambassador Makarova, say that they're very offended by this term because it was
yeah,
the origin of the term was this
yeah,
vast geographic area with Russia as the political, geographic, economic center.
yeah.
Ukrainians hate that word. When I mentioned this to Marlène Laruelle, you probably know,
Well, yeah, yeah, of course.
she said at the IRIS, the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies,
Yeah.
she said, well, what else would we call it? And that's a good point.
It is a good point, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
I've struggled. Yeah. The obvious answer is that there isn't a perfect solution to this because
and
I mean you could call it Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, I suppose. Well, that doesn't really get across the South Caucasus. So
well,
you can't win.
I appealed to people on this call. Come up with
Yes.
something better.
I would give you
Yeah.
I'll give you all the tea I possibly in China that I could possibly give you or whatever if I could.
Um,
Um, there
now,
you go.
and just to give everybody a relative sense, James gave us the yearly budget of Chatham House. Um, Council on Foreign Relations budget is 3 times more. That doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
any better. But just to give you a relative perspective, I
Yeah.
think Chatham House punches above its weight. I think it's a very trusted, wonderful institution.
That's
And
kind.
we'll move to the pamphlet in a moment.
Yeah.
Let's see, Trump and NATO. You mentioned if you mentioned some hypothetical possibilities. You said that the U.S. and Germany are not eager to have Ukraine. I guess the idea is if you're in a state of war, we're not prepared to do Article 5, right? Is that their is that the reason?
That would appear to be it, and you can also see that again the strain of Russian thinking, the Russian narrative has infected policymakers' views of this, and it, they are, I'm afraid, at the end of the day, nervous about after all of this time, to use metaphor or allegory, they're nervous of antagonizing the bear in spite of all that Russia has done and how and it's the chaos that it causes, somehow they believe that Ukraine's entry into NATO would do something to enrage it further. I
Yeah,
find that hard to understand how what that could look like beyond what it's already doing, but
yeah,
that would appear to be the case, and I'm afraid you do hear that in a lot of. But I guess again, this is what I would say is this is an example of Stockholm syndrome, prisoners of your own mind.
yes,
And if you, of course, if a lot of people think, especially people who don't do international relations, your friends out there who have normal jobs and normal lives, unlike us, and they, of course, if they're of over a certain age, probably over the age of 40 or so, then they will indeed think of Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and Moldova as being, I know it sounds absolutely crass, as being part of Russia. And because they haven't gotten used to the idea that 1991 happened, those states split and went their own way, and they can't help but think that they're in Russia's orbit. And actually, I would blame Barack Obama for this. There was an article he produced in The Atlantic, I think, or maybe it was an interview rather than an article, um, in about 2011, give or take. I'm sorry, I may have the date wrong. Um, and he said, listen, these countries will always be more or less in Russia's orbit. And I think that is a fundamental mistake because that's just not true that geographical countries that are geographically proximate have to be in their neighbors' orbits. And we see that plenty in the Americas and in Europe as well. So I think that is a lack of imagination on Barack Obama's part, if I may, that he couldn't see a world whereby these countries can take their own initiative and go it their own way. It's also George H.W. Bush's fault. Yeah, Dan knows what I'm
the
going to say. And
chicken
in
chicken Kiev, yeah,
Chicken Kiev,
yeah.
1991,
Uh-huh.
in Kiev itself, and he beseeched the countries of the former Soviet Union not to go too far their own way. Of course, that is again that's contrary to people's natural inclinations. It's contrary to it's like it's like teenagers telling them to telling them not to stray too far too fast. They're gonna go and do some stuff, right? And so I think that the problem is that again so George Bush and Barack Obama from different sides of the divide nonetheless failed to imagine that the world could look different despite George H.W. Bush talking about a new world order.
Uh-huh.
Chicken Kiev speech is contrary to the new world order speech actually.
Um, yeah, a little background on the so-called Chicken Kiev speech. I think the name was made up by a journalist, but
Yes.
the not very well mentally endowed Vice President Dan Quayle
Ah.
referred to it many times. The background, I mean, I met, from what I understand, Bush Sr. and Gorbachev had a special relationship in that they had had secret conversations. This was not the walk in the woods, but they did have a walk in the woods. And Bush was not yet elected. I think James knows the story.
Yeah.
And he said to Gorbachev, please understand, I'm hoping to be president. And if I succeed in public, I will be obliged to say bad things about you. But please understand it's political pressure. It's not my real opinion. And
Right.
Gorbachev, according to this story, responded in kind. And he said, well, my military, same thing. So let's agree, we're going to say bad things. And I believe that Bush's idea in the Chicken Kiev speech, which was Ukrainians just be patient, was basically what he said. I think he said this with a larger strategic goal of not pushing Gorbachev too quickly into the reform that would have brought down Gorbachev. So all of these things are complicated, aren't they, James? And we can add to what you just said. The many red lines, I'm sure you know of Ben Hodges, who says twice a week in his videos, he says, we've crossed 50 red lines and nothing happened. So why don't we cross a few more? And this is the U.S. military is saying this almost with one voice. Just keep going, go further, go further.
This is the essence of this. That's absolutely right, Dan. The essence of it is that, and this is what's so galling, is that Ukraine could have won this war by now, more or less, basically. And that had we had that imagination, had we put in at the beginning what we put in towards the end, if you agree we are coming towards the end, had we done more militarily, financially, rhetorically, diplomatically as well, then actually Russia would have been forced into very difficult decisions, which it has not yet been forced into. And maybe they're down, and maybe it still is coming that way, and that's the good news. But the bad news, of course, is that Ukraine is now on a very short lifeline. And in fact, the trajectory of the war is not necessarily a positive one for Ukraine.
Right.
Who I think that Vladimir Putin has been betting the farm on Donald Trump winning the election. He has done that. Vladimir Putin still thinks he can win. He may well be right, but that's not because of him. And it's not because of the Ukrainians. It's because of us. And I think the biggest fear I have is that the West betrays Ukraine, not for the first time in its history. Dan and I spoke about that very briefly earlier. And that we build up this resentment in Ukraine and Ukrainians, that is Ukrainians who are in exile, but also Ukrainians in Ukraine, and that we lose them. Yeah, we lose them as a valued ally. We lose their ability. We lose their technical innovation, their military competence and experience. Now we lose, but we whilst we took Ukrainians into our homes in 2022, then it could all be for nothing, and it's quite meaningless if we don't follow through on our initial pleas. But I say those initial pleas, but it is not clear to me, quite frankly, Dan, and I don't know what you think and others think. It's not clear to me that the West, broadly writ, and I know that's a very wide term you can drive a bus through. It's not clear to me that we actually wanted Ukraine to win and that Russia to lose. We were afraid of Russia losing. We don't understand what Ukrainian winning means. We don't understand the consequences of Russia winning. We don't understand the consequences of Ukraine losing. And these things have not been clearly communicated either to both to the people and to policymakers. This ought to have been done back in 2022, if not before, let alone now in 2025.
You say we, James, and I think you mean Western countries, North America, NATO. We won't say EU. That's an embarrassing term. But
we can talk about that.
But two questions there. First, you talk about Russia being defeated. I can't imagine the largest country in the world. You could say they were defeated by the Golden Hordes, defeated by the King of Sweden in the 17th century. But what would a defeated Russia be? What would that be?
Well, I mean, everyone can define it in their own way, and I think the Ukrainians in particular will have to define it in their own way. But if it comes to that, but I suppose, I mean, again, Russia's defeat is I would use that term analogously with Ukraine's victory. So we're also asking, in the same question, we're asking, what would Ukraine's victory look like? And we could discuss what we think Volodymyr Zelensky would take now if he were to be offered something on a plate, and I think he's going to just be offered a very little more than a freezing of the lions, by the way, right now. Yeah. But that would not obviously be a victory for Ukraine. That would not be a defeat for Russia, because Russia would therefore be occupying 20% or so, 21% of Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine wouldn't have any security guarantees. It wouldn't have any justice. It wouldn't have any money. Well, wouldn't yet have any money for reparations. So I think that would be an out and out failure, quite frankly, on everybody's part, except possibly Russia's. Although oddly enough, that would also be a failure on Russia's part, because of course, and I can't stress this point too much.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Everyone okay? I can't stress this point too much, but Vladimir Putin wants control more than territory. So he wants to control Ukraine's destiny, which he believes is inextricably tied up with Russia's own destiny. And so I'm not therefore convinced that Vladimir Putin, let alone Volodymyr Zelensky, would be satisfied with, an American plan, if you like, of freezing the conflict where it is, because Ukraine wouldn't have what it wants in terms of its country back, and Russia wouldn't have what it wants in terms of its control over Kiev. So that's why I'm skeptical of the chances of even this, legislatively, impressive administration actually actually manage to get what it has promised in here. I think the Biden administration promised very little, but it did sort of deliver on its promises, and the Trump administration is going to promise a lot, and of course I think it's going to have trouble delivering.
Um, Sorry about the unbearable noise here. Workmen are removing my windows. I'll be muted
Okay,
mainly. Um,
gotcha. So I
Based
hope you
on
can
what,
hear me.
no, I can hear you. I want people not to hear me. Putin, many people have said any agreement with Putin has no value. Your comment on that Putin would
Yeah,
sign anything, and then the Budapest Memorandum, the Minsk
yeah,
Agreement,
yeah,
trashed. So comment
yeah.
on.
Sure, sure. And I'm so sorry for what you're going through, Dan. Listen, you're right, of course, but Vladimir Putin never met an agreement he liked. And I think this, the ultimate litmus test of this actually is one you didn't mention. It's Helsinki. Okay, I'm not saying Putin signed it, of course. It was actually co-written by the Russians. And it states that countries, the recognized countries of the world, have a right to make their own alliances and to join the multilaterals of their choice and to decide their own orientation. That's basically what it is. And there's no doubt about it that Vladimir Putin feels that that agreement was made when Russia was weak. Now he thinks that it's strong. One can debate that, of course, and so he is trying to rewrite the agreements, not just that, not the agreements that the West imposed upon Russia. That's the Russian narrative, but the agreements that Russia was forced into, as he sees it, when in the 1990s, when Russia was supposedly in chaos and led by a drunken imbecile, as Putin would sort of claim in the form of Boris Yeltsin. So I do think that one should be extremely skeptical of any agreement that Russia signs. The Budapest Memorandum is the most glaring example, but not the only one, which obviously agreed that Ukraine would be a sovereign independent state along its 1991 borders, as long as it in exchange for relinquishing its nuclear weapons. And um, it clearly wasn't worth the paper it was written on. It's as simple as that. Russia has walked all over it with abandon. And of course, that's just one example. I mean, Russia simply does not respect the sovereignty of any of the post-Soviet states, and actually beyond that, into the Warsaw Pact countries, and we know that it's responsible for assassination attempts and explosions and subversion of governments. Well, on a global scale, quite honestly, from all the way to Madagascar, let alone, and I'm not even joking. I mean, literally happened. So I think that again, we still seem to have not woken up to that. Even though I think people think, oh well, it's just Russia. It's what Russia does, or it's no worse. And I think maybe worse. People say, is it really worse than anybody else? Don't we all break the rules? And of course we do, but not to that extent. not to the extent that Russia does. Russia's breaking of the rules is of a far more egregious, serious, and life-threatening, or life-ending nature, rather, than anybody else's, by far.
That being the case, what would be the value in negotiating? Would that be a foolish waste of time?
Yeah, I think it would be. I suppose that obviously all parties concerned, including the Europeans, but the Ukrainians as well. Sorry, Ukrainians are Europeans, I should say, but all parties are looking at the moment to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt and seeing what it is that they come up with. Um, but once bitten, twice shy, and all that. And the Ukrainians will certainly be skeptical, for example, of a repeat of Georgia 2008. I mean, quite frankly, Russia also came in then, took 20% of its of Georgian territory. The Europeans, in this case, flew in, got Russia to sign an agreement, and only to find that the Russians simply didn't respect it. And Russia, to this day, occupies the same amount of territory in Georgia as it did before. So I do believe that it's not so much that I am anti-diplomacy as such, because there is a place for everything, but it is, don't forget, in the nature of diplomats to want to manage a situation, to bring people to a negotiating table, to get compromise. And of course, one has to ask oneself then, what part of Russia's narrative do we compromise with? And that might be an imposed compromise, as in Ukraine, you will stop fighting now and accept that this territory is gone. But then one has to ask oneself. I don't have the answers here, I'm afraid, Dan. But surely that the Ukrainians would carry on fighting, whether it be in a guerrilla war nature, or simply not respecting the ceasefire. But I mean, look at it. I mean, I can't imagine that incidents such as this morning's incident, whereby a Russian general appears to have been assassinated on the banks of the Moskva River. But that would not continue happening even in the event of an imposed ceasefire, because the Ukrainians will regard it as being unjust.
Well, if I say the term frozen conflict, what is your reaction?
Well, we've
If
yeah.
winning is unrealistic, and if negotiations are going to be phony because of Putin's lack of respect, what other possibility is there other than, I hate to say this, frozen conflict?
No, I hear exactly what you're saying, and that would appear to be where we're going, because not least because that's where so many conflicts have gone in the past, in the sense that um, uh, the Transnistrian dispute between Moldova and that breakaway region was more or less frozen. The conflict between Georgia and Russia has been frozen. The conflict between Karabakh was frozen,
Yeah.
but with a significant difference, that eventually Azerbaijan felt itself to be strong enough to take Armenia, and rightly or wrongly, it did just that. And that war had only one winner, when Azerbaijan was strong enough. So you can, I know people will argue, and it's a perfectly reasonable argument, that freezing the conflict will give Russia the time to rebuild its military. But I'll just add one codicil to that, which is that it will also give Ukraine time too, bearing in to find ways through the front line in which it's not able to do in wartime, when it's in the desperate situation it is right now. And if you take the view that Russia's economy is weakening the country, or just is being weakened right now, and is in an enfeebled state, then it's going to be hard for Russia to rebuild at the rate in which it would like, even if that means the impoverishment of a people, which of course Putin doesn't care about, etc., etc. So again, that's why I'm slightly more optimistic for the longer term, partly because I don't think that the Ukrainians will respect a ceasefire, and I don't think that the Russians can carry on doing this ad nauseum.
Thank you. All of these are terrible things to think about. Let's
Yeah.
talk about UK. Keir Starmer went 2 weeks ago
Mm.
and he said 100 years of cooperation.
Right.
What was that all about?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm ashamed to say I don't really know. But let's dig into it a little bit. I mean, look, he hadn't been to Ukraine since he became prime minister, although Volodymyr Zelensky had visited the UK twice and spoken at cabinet meetings. So I think it was something that needed to be done performatively, and of course visits are performative, and of course the deals are worked out beforehand, not when one is there. That's just the way politics is. There's a great deal of showmanship there. I do, but there's even more showmanship than usual when you talk about the 100 years. I mean, it's slightly meaningless, isn't it? You know, what does it? What if you even if you take, to be honest with you, even if you reject the 100 years point, then it's four. I think the it was 4 billion a year for as long as it takes. So then we get into the discussion about what does as long as it takes mean, and then one wonders how is that protected against A, inflation, and B, against changes in the situation in the war, and a deal done, and changes of governments in the UK in the future. I mean, I find in a sense it's I'm not suggesting you shouldn't offer long-term commitments, but I do think that there's an element of hyperbole and non-realism here. I mean, we are, of course, Ukraine needs to be supported and invested in far into the future, no doubt about that. So if that's what it means, and I think it is partly what it means, then fair enough. The UK has done, you know, a reasonable job. I think it's held in fairly high esteem in Ukraine, although again, this government perhaps less so than the previous one, which got kicked out in the summer of last year. So I think they had to do some work to make up for it. Um, and one wonders now, again, with Trump's re-election in the US, the extent to which this government is going to try and toe that is navigate, shall we say, that line, and to which, or the extent to which it's going to go it alone. I mean, the whole point of Brexit, which you kindly didn't refer to, almost, Dan, then is that the UK would have more independence in its foreign policy. I'm not sure that we've necessarily seen that right now. I think Keir Starmer is in Brussels today trying to negotiate new packages which would tie us back into Brussels. But beyond that, then yeah, it's look again. All politicians have to navigate the line between an unrealistic deal and a deal that looks like it's, you know, feather light. But it's I think this government is struggling on so many levels right now, having very relatively recently come into power, and it's not sufficiently prepared for the realities of power and the difficulties the international situation is imposing upon it. So we are, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult time for the US, and I have every sympathy for you, Dan, and any other Americans on this call. But it's also a very difficult time for the UK because they are struggling or barely keeping their neck above water. They're not about to lose power, by the way. It's not like Norway last week or whatever. But it's nonetheless. I think we're struggling to find our place in the world. Although I have to, having said that, and having been quite critical, last thing I would say on this is uh, that despite the changes of government and the tumult in British politics, then the support for Ukraine has been fairly consistent over various prime ministers, good and dreadful. Then the support for Ukraine has actually been on a relative level. It's not like in say the Czech Republic or one way, or Slovakia the other way, where a change of government seems to result in a U-turn on Ukraine policy, or Russia policy, if you prefer.
Thanks for your sympathy, James, but we probably brought it upon ourselves. Of course, we on this call, I can just say, certainly voted against Trump, but
Yeah.
our own countrymen, I'm not sure we deserve your sympathy, but thank you. Also,
You have it anyway.
David Lammy is very
Yeah,
active. If and I think most Britons now regret Brexit. I think a majority, perhaps.
I think
So,
so too.
so without maybe there will never be a chance to reverse that bad decision. But
Yeah.
given that, if you have a prime minister and a foreign minister working these deals, do you think there could be kind of an equivalent of returning to Europe in some ways?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I do think that over time, the fallacy of Brexit will become increasingly obvious when obviously it's our number one trading partner and it's now more expensive to trade with that trading partner, and that has a very real effect on the economy, and it's taking percentage points off of our GDP. So I think that that will be, but you can't tell that immediately, and it's relatively recent Brexit, and these things don't happen overnight. I also think that, um, but it would take quite a courageous government, and most UK governments I'm familiar with, present and past, have not been courageous to take or to apply again, and come back and say, "I'm sorry, please forgive us." Take us back. That's a step beyond which this government does not. I mean, of course, nobody in the Labour Party voted for Brexit, but that doesn't mean to say they want to have the mess and for it to, frankly, for it to dominate their term as it would do if they did. So they're thinking, they're unfortunately they're playing politics, and they are not. It's just an area they don't want to go. They don't want to approach.
Well, it would be an endless, agonizing process, wouldn't it? At
Of course it would. Yes.
minimum 18 months, maybe 2 years. Um, Let me express some thoughts of
Yeah.
I think I'm a Britophile. You just mentioned the term "find its place in the world." This is a very esoteric idea, but I think Great Britain after World War II, which was very much damaged by the war and which lost its colonies and made some economic errors, perhaps, has found a new model, which I think the United States could learn from. Great Britain ruled the waves for 300 years, and
Right.
but it has not vanished as a very significant world player. I really admire personally what Britain has been able to do, having lost so much of what it had in the 19th century. It has found a place. I hope that the United States, which seems to be losing influence rapidly, could learn from your example. And of course, we have our own Brexit as of yesterday,
Yeah.
in that we withdrew from Canada, our biggest trading partner, and Mexico.
Yeah. And Mexico.
The
Yeah.
US trade is by far more trade with Canada and Mexico than with China or the EU. So this is a very self-damaging thing. It's kind of a Brexit for
Yeah.
on the part of the United States.
Yeah.
Um, Tell us, when you look back at the Biden approach to Ukraine, it's easy to criticize and smash
Yeah.
him. He gave a little and a little more and a little more. He was afraid of
Yeah.
red lines. He
Yeah.
crossed red lines, and many are saying he could have done much more. When you use the term "as long as it takes," that's a Biden term, and
Yeah.
nobody had any idea what he meant. So, is it time to start evaluating the Biden legacy in all of this?
Yeah, it is time on the basis that it's gone and it's dead now. So there's nothing more that it can do. And on that basis, yeah, it's easy to criticize. But if it's easy to criticize, that's probably because criticism is merited. And whilst, of course, I think they were decent people, and I think they were professionals, and they had experience. They didn't. Nobody had any experience of anything quite like this, quite frankly, because you'd have to go back to World War II pretty much. And so I don't think that and it did. So it didn't quite count for much. I guess I think back to Dalip Singh, in fact, who said that he'd slapped sanctions on Russia after 2014, after MH17, I think, and he realized that he'd slapped on more sanctions onto Russia than had ever been done before. But he also realized, he said, that the scale of the problem was so much greater than ever before. So yes, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. Yes, it was. This was. It had some, very major restrictions on it even before the second invasion of February 2022. But it wasn't nearly enough, bearing in mind the size of Russia's appetites, desires, and ambitions. They far exceeded anything that the West imposed upon it to restrict Russia. I mean, it was thought that they would have um, dissuasive, it's not quite the right word, a deterrent effect ultimately. Um, and of course, that was completely not true. And the reason it's not true is because we underestimated Vladimir Putin. He is an obsessive and a sociopathic one at that. And his calculations don't bear any resemblance to ours. They are based upon the idea that Russia is a great power, must be a great power, always will be a great power, must control the region around it with a cordon sanitaire, um, and um, and that outweighs rational economic considerations, and frankly, if I'm honest with you, it even outweighs his own desire to stay in power, because actually he did. I know he didn't leave power in 2008, of course, when he castled with Medvedev, but I actually think that his overriding ambition, for what it's worth, is not longevity, even though he's clearly in it for a long term now in year 25, if you include that period of castling. Then he is somebody who, and of course he's a very rich man. I've no doubt he is stashed away billions, as we've seen from the Navalny videos of palaces in Russia's south, etc., etc. But I do think actually that he does have um, a more sort of holistic consideration, and that his ultimate desire is for Russia to continue its um, or to continue its destiny as one of the world's great powers, to sit at the top table of three powers. That's the US and China and Russia, even though Russia doesn't even remotely get to that stage on really any metric you like, except of course for geographical size, amount of hydrocarbons in the world, in the ground, numbers of nuclear weapons. And yes, okay, on those ones, it is of course a large or a great power if you use those metrics. But on most normal metrics, of course, it's really not. But that's just so I see Putin. Putin thought that he was Phoenix from the flames, that Russia could rise out of the ashes, and make Russia great again, to coin a phrase.
Um, there's this weird esoteric philosophical thinking, Dugin and others, which we know have
Yeah.
influenced Putin, and it's quite crazy, as you know, and assumes that Russia is the world's only hope, and that everybody else is without any merit. To what extent do you think Russian people even have any notion of this philosophy? Do they? This is pretty esoteric stuff.
Yeah, do you know what I think they kind of do? I mean, look, they've all been, Russia's a highly educated country, and they've been educated, and of course, many of them have been educated either in Soviet ways or in I'm saying the same thing, but or have been brainwashed more recently, and that is to think about the other states that comprise the Soviet Union as theirs, as what the Russians would call malinki brat, little brother, not equals, but nonetheless connected in the kindred sense. And so that strain of thinking affects both the people who've been born since the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course who were born well during it, if you like. And so, and it goes, and as I say, so I mentioned that affecting Westerners in our mindset and the Stockholm syndrome that befalls us. But it absolutely affects Russians, and I think I'm afraid that Russians do regard um, non-Orthodox non-Orthodox religions, people of a different ethnic background, people of a different, perhaps with a non-heteronormative sexuality, and people from the South Caucasus, people from Central Asia, as being lesser but nonetheless enthralled to Greater Russia. And with that thinking, I do think it's esoteric, but somehow it seems to give them comfort that they are part of something. Another way of looking at it is the fact that you can make the argument that the war isn't popular. Of course, it's not popular amongst soldiers. It's not popular amongst mothers, sisters, wives, in particular. But at the same time, I think that there is also a feeling in Russia that now that they're in it, they might as well win it, which is to say that and that maybe not a motivating factor in the way that Ukraine's is, because for Ukraine it's obviously existential, but it is a motivating factor. I do think that they're you know Russian pride and patriotism obviously bleeding into outright nationalism and racism is a driving factor for Russian soldiers and politicians alike, and the public. I guess my point is that I don't think we can exculpate, or we can't, we shouldn't let the Russian people off the hook for this war, because they are responsible for pulling triggers, making bombs, forming Z formations, inculcating their children, etc., etc.
Totally agree for what that's worth. I'm mindful of your time, James. You have like 4 minutes.
Thank you.
What you just said made me think maybe Samuel Huntington was right after all.
Yeah, I know, right? Isn't that
With the
disappointing?
line, the cultural lines being drawn. If people
Yeah.
here are not familiar with that, Huntington, who was the professor of many of the people we now have.
Yeah, of course he was.
Saw culture as a inevitable source of conflict. He was much
Yeah,
ridiculed in the
he
90s,
was.
and then he was
Yeah,
kind of
it's coming back, right?
well, after
Absolutely.
9/11, people went back and started reading Huntington. In the few minutes left, you showed us this wonderful pamphlet, which I have and have read. Can you give us an idea of how it was put together and what it says?
Yeah, so listen, I mean, so this goes back to the point about Chatham House. I mean, and I suppose my program and how I think about things. And again, I think about things, I come at things from a point of view that the states of the that once comprised the Soviet Union are independent and sovereign and free. And so when those concepts are challenged, in this case by Russia, but also by people in the West as well, then I have to think to myself, what is the most impactful thing I can do? And what you play to your strengths, and that's one thing. The first strength is having that as a principle, and the second strength is your team and knowing who you've got. So it's a that publication is a multi-author publication. I think that I can't remember how many of them are, but I think there's about 12 authors, and they've all got their specialism. One on Ukraine, one on some people have a more military background, some people have a more of a diplomatic background, some people are more European inclined, some people more internal Russia, and so you play to their strengths and you ask a series of research questions, and you write to a very strict formula with the same subheadings for everybody, and I can just so in other words, basically we put it the way we did it, Dan. Just I know you know, but just to tell everybody else is we put down several fallacies, and those fallacies were, I can't remember them all, but things like Ukraine should adopt neutrality, or Russian security concerns must be respected, or this is costing too much, or Ukraine's pursuit of justice hinders peace. So these things, okay, which people come out with all the time. They get trotted out, and we explained under each fallacy why it was a fallacy, who was saying it, why it was wrong, and what a better way of doing it might be, of coming to it might be. So that's where we came to with it. And so and then we took it to Washington, we took it to Budapest, we took it to Brussels, and tried to get people to come on board with it. But I guess we failed.
No, not. I mean, you have even at his worst, President Biden said, as long as it takes, and
Yeah.
he didn't fall prey to the fallacies. James,
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
you have something else in about 1 minute.
I know. I'm so
Is
sorry.
but the pamphlet I believe is free online. If you can send me the link.
I'll send you the link for sure. And could I just say to everybody on this call, listen, I'm sorry we didn't get to chat, but if you want to get in touch, please do. Dan's got my details, and I'll be happy to engage in a conversation or whatever. But I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. It's a real pleasure.
James, thank you so much, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank
Take
you.
care, y'all.
Okay.
Bye bye.